seen so many teams that don't have that sense of continual improvement because they work on the work that flows across their desk.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. Today will be the first of a two-part series covering the DevOps movement, what it means for organizations, and what makes an elite software team. I'm Julian, the CEO of Haystack, where we're helping teams get incredibly good at delivering software. And we do that by providing world-class metrics and analytics to help establish some of the DevOps concepts we'll be talking about today. And I'll also be joined by Dave Mango, who coincidentally has been working on that same mission for years, one of the best DevOps coaches in the industry who successfully led DevOps transformations at some pretty world-class companies. Most notably, we met talking about him leading the charge at Salesforce, really helping them adopt the DevOps movement and transformed how they delivered software over there. So today, Dave will be sharing his experiences, his advice, his learnings from those many years leading the DevOps movement. And specifically, we'll be covering why it matters, how it benefits organizations, and what it really looks like to be an elite software team. So before getting started, Dave, I just want to thank you so much for joining me for this series. And I know we work on that same mission of helping teams get incredibly good at delivering software. So why don't you tell some of the listeners a little bit more about what you're working on?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Yeah, as you said, I sort of lucked into the DevOps movement, I would say. I wish I could take a lot of credit for it, but like lots of things in life, I think sometimes it's the right place, the right time. Have sort of been working on transformations my kind of whole career. And then in the past few years, I started a company called Mangoteque, and I work with private equity investors and their CTOs to help them get the most amount that they can out of their investments. So as you and I are going to talk about, it turns out being really good at DevOps, there's mathematical proof that turns your company into a company that's much better able to execute, meet their goals, things like that. And so these investors want to make sure from the moment that an acquisition happens, the clock is ticking. And they want to get the most out of their investment as soon as they possibly can. And so being able to apply these kinds of principles allows them to do just that.
So in this case, we're talking about how to get the most ROI on your investment, but ultimately, engineering performance and delivery is what helps drive not only that ROI investment, but organizational growth. And hopefully we could talk about that in a little bit in this conversation as well. We've already had...
One of the things I like the most is that in addition to these companies becoming really good at delivering software, the engineers have a much better work environment. And so it's sort of like everybody wins is the secret of the DevOps movement, which is pretty awesome.
And I think that's one thing that often goes overlooked, like the engineering benefit as well, not only for leadership to see the improvement for the organization, to see increased profitability and market share, customer satisfaction, but at the end of the day, some of the concepts that we'll be talking about today, maybe for some of the listeners, you can just put the lens on for an engineer themselves, because the day-to-day improvements are pretty profound when you look at it, even at that individual contributor level. So
yeah, I was talking to a COO of a well-known company, let's just say, about an engagement, and I said, "Well, what do you want out of this engagement? Like, what's your ideal home run?" And he said, "I want all my software developers to be excited about coming to work every day." And I was like, okay, that's pretty awesome.
That's a pretty good goal. That's a pretty good goal. So super excited to share some of the insights. It sounds like you've been working in this space for quite some time and have a whole bunch of experience at various companies, from startups to some of the biggest companies in the world. So sort of to kick us off, we keep talking about DevOps, the DevOps movement. Can you help some of the listeners understand what are we talking about exactly?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been doing this for 20 something years already. And, there's a couple of things in my career that have sort of bugged me. And one of them was, back around 2000, the dot-com boom, all that. My teams would be, the operations teams would be, releasing code into production that the developers threw over the wall to us. Your standard thing we talk about all the time. And I'd be like, oh yeah, my team's really valuable. And that leadership would be like, yeah, operations is the cost center. The value is delivered from the developers. Operations doesn't really contribute anything. And so that always kind of bothered me. And then, with the rise of like Google SRE and things like that, years later, people started to recognize that operations can be a strategic differentiator for the business. And I think it was a woman who was a vice president at Microsoft at the time who actually wrote an article about that. And then when the DevOps movement like sort of really came into being, like 2009, there was like all this, very similar ideas to the SRE movement, but like this idea that like operations isn't just a cost center. Like being able to deliver software well is not just happening in development, it's happening throughout the entire value stream. And so I was really lucky to be, obviously, like we said, like getting involved like right in the beginning of the DevOps movement, because I really loved this idea that it took everybody. It wasn't just the developers and it wasn't just operations. And obviously we've grown and matured the movement over the past decade or whatever, so that people are talking about DevSecOps and like all kinds of other things beyond just development and operations, which is great because it is an entire system. And so it's been really gratifying to like be a part of that and help make that grow to whatever extent that I can.
It's also very exciting to see that shift, I presume, as well, going from viewing it as a cost center to quite literally, I think you mentioned mathematical proof that this stuff really works. And now we're seeing a rise in DevSecOps, DevX, SRE, all these functions who are specifically focused on that value stream and actually turning the entire value stream and removing those friction and bottlenecks into a strategic advantage of companies. And I'd be hard pressed to find a company, let's say Netflix, Google, all the biggest companies who have some of the most elite engineering teams in the world without some of these functions. And I think that shows how incredibly powerful it can be for an organization as a whole.
No, yeah. I mean, I think I loved what you said about the growth because, in the early days of the DevOps movement, we would be in like Mountain View for like DevOps days, Mountain View or whatever. But people would tell us they would fly into California, they would go to these events, and then they would fly back to wherever they were from. And none of this stuff was happening where they were. Like it was only in Silicon Valley and in California that this stuff was happening. And as we all know now, like it's spread throughout the world. Like, DevOps Days Tel Aviv is amazing. And, I've spoken at DevOps Days Belgium, and, it's a thing, it's a worldwide movement. And it's not just happening in California anymore. And the companies have realized that being good at this, understanding the DevOps movement, applying these things, what we like to call high performers or elite performers, is really important now for their business. It's not something that they can look in on from the outside and say, hey, that looks kind of interesting. Now it's like all of my competitors are doing this. And if I don't do this, I might not be the competition anymore. I just might not exist.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that we see such a large growth in the DevOps movement. It works, right? The days of just focusing on uptime and reliability, trying to strive for those 3 nines, those 4 nines, is no longer the sole focus. I think it's incredibly powerful when you have that ops team, whether DevSecOps, DevX, SRE, really focus on removing the bottlenecks of developers, often overlooked, but build times, all these capabilities that I'm sure you're going to go into in a bit really do dramatically impact how we can deliver software. And I think it's almost death by 1,000 cuts when you're not focused on this sort of stuff. It's all these inefficiencies and bottlenecks throughout the process that really drag the engineering team down, which makes it incredibly difficult to deliver value to customers, to fix bugs, to get feedback quickly. And now it's refreshing to see so much focus on removing these bottlenecks, and once again putting it through the lens of an engineer. Hey, you've got a team to help remove these bottlenecks, get your code to production faster with reliability and test suites and all these things, which is super exciting from leadership perspective, business perspective, and both of us coming from engineering backgrounds, the engineer's perspective as well.
Yeah, if I had $1 for every COO that said to me, my ops team can't keep up with my dev team, because to your point, like it's a mind shift. Like it's a different way of looking at the world. The world that I grew up in operations was very much like file a ticket, and like that's just not the way we do stuff anymore. And people have to make these transitions. And to your point, Like I always like to explain DevOps to people is it's a mix of speed and quality, because too many people like get caught up on the CI/CD stuff and think that that's DevOps.
Right.
And I'm like, that's part of it. Yeah, but you can't have DevOps without game days, without like inducing failures and stuff like that. And that doesn't exist in CI/CD.
Right. Well, very exciting. And I want to talk a little bit about the capabilities, who this fits for. It's obviously, a change in mindset and in some cases a big investment into DevOps, which we'll talk about in a bit. But before even getting into that, I wanted to quickly cover, why this even matters. I know we're talking about business outcomes and impact engineering teams, but could you give a little bit more color on what are the business outcomes? You mentioned mathematical proof showing that we can help impact businesses using this movement. Can you go a little bit further into that?
Yeah. So, I mean, like we said, back in the day, people used to fly to California, go to these conferences, and then go back to their companies or whatever. And then they were like, we're not doing this stuff here. There have been a number of things, like we said, that have moved the entire movement forward. One of them would be like, John Allspaw and Paul Hammond's 10 deploys a day at Flickr, DevOps cooperation, or whatever that talk was called at Velocity. That was mind blowing for people who had been doing 10 deploys a day. Like, we don't do 10 deploys a year. Like, how are you doing 10 deploys a day? It's just completely like bonkers to hear somebody give a talk like that. But then another major change or whatever step forward for the movement was the 2019 State of DevOps report, whether you call it the Accelerate report or the DORA research report. But basically, like the report that Dr. Fosgren put out, and then they came out with the companion book Accelerate, which won the Shingo Award and all kinds of stuff like that. Which shows you like how groundbreaking this was. But they identified 4 key metrics, which I know are important to Haystack as well, which are, deployment frequency, lead time for changes, change failure rate, and time to recover. And you'll notice, as someone who's a very close student of those metrics, that I didn't say mean time to recover, and we can get into why that is if you really want to. But those 4 metrics really are indicators of how high performing your team is. And then one of my favorite quotes that came out of that report was, our highest performers are twice as likely to meet or exceed their organization's performance goals. And you can go read the last third of the book if you want to get deep on the math for why that is. But that's kind of crazy, right? And for me, like when I'm working with investors and stuff like that, who doesn't want to double their chances of meeting or exceeding the goals that they set out? Like, if I have a 3 to 5 year investment thesis, like I want to make money at the end of that. That's why I'm in business. So really, this doesn't mean like we can just go rub some DevOps on it and everything's going to be fine, because, that's hard to do. And there's lots of examples of cargo culting, which we can get into as well, which, isn't going to work. Like we need to solve the problems that our business has, like, and that's different for every business, because everyone likes to joke about the Spotify model, but like unless you're actually Spotify, you may have similar problems to them, but you don't have their exact problems. And people need to come up with these solutions that match their things. But ultimately it's important because if you listen to those metrics, right, deployment frequency and lead time for changes, like that's about speed, because you and I were talking about speed before. And then change failure rate and time to recover is about quality. Like, how much downtime do we have, things like that. So again, the DevOps movement comes back to speed and quality, and we can even see that inside those 4 key metrics. And now we have the math, an entire book that proves why those things are actually good indicators.
It's fantastic to see that book. I think they also made the point that both speed and quality are not conflicting. You can actually get them both done using the same initiatives. We can get faster while improving quality. And if we take a step back, I always like to think about what that actually means as an engineering team is running and how it fits into the business. And ultimately, if we're pushing higher quality code faster, that means it's less prone to error. It's easier to review. You get faster feedback from other engineers. You get faster feedback from customers. I think there's no doubt why Mark Andreessen, for example, talking about investors, has a famous quote: cycle time compression is the most underestimated factor in determining winners and losers in tech, because it's so powerful when you're able to get this combination of speed and quality and improve on that over time. It's so impactful to the business, and at the end of the day, you can really see how a company that's able to do that really well is able to find product market fit. Let's say if you're a startup, or even scale a new series of product lines, innovate faster, all because of this concept of speed and quality. So there's math to prove it. I would urge anybody that's listening to read Accelerate, because it's pretty amazing, some of the math behind it.
Yeah, I
How,
like to think about it. I don't know if you, there's the book The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and he always talks about running experiments, right? It's very much in this Andreessen kind of way of looking at the world, and Jez Humbles talks about this a lot too. But it's like, if I can deploy quickly and, small changes, to your point, I can run a ton of experiments. And if I'm deploying 10 times a day and you're deploying 10 times a year, that means you can run 10 experiments a year and I can run 10 experiments a day. Who's going to achieve product market fit faster? Who's going to be able to deploy new product? Who's going to be able to do that? It's just not fair at that point. It's, it's asymmetric warfare. Like, you don't stand a chance against me because I can go out and run those experiments and get my answers and adjust and do those focus groups. And what you're doing that 10 times a year, get out. You're just just absolutely not.
I love that. 10 times a year, you can't even really compete with somebody who's iterating 10 times a day. And oftentimes, between the engineering and the product organizations, there's often this question of, well, if we're focused on speed versus quality, isn't it more important that we build the right thing and spend time figuring out what the right thing to do is? And my answer to that is always, how engineering supports that answer. What building the right thing is fast experimentation. It is increasing speed and quality so that we can actually get that feedback from customers and figure out what the right thing to build actually is. But if we're deploying, let's say, 10 times a year, like you said, then the product side, the business side, is getting that feedback 10 times a year, as opposed to that 120 times a year, whatever you have. So pretty interesting how it impacts the overall business. I know you mentioned that engineers are often happier when this DevOps movement is in place. Do you have examples of that? I have a feeling you have a story behind it or something like that. Would love to hear more about how this impacts engineering teams themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I started my career as a software developer before I moved over into operations. And I know the things that engineers want to do is they want to ship code, and they want to, they want their work to be valuable. Like, they don't want to just feel like they're just a code monkey. They're doing nothing, like, who cares, whatever. And so, depending on what your field is, or whatever, you can have different amounts of impact. I know for me, I was working with one company, and we're all full cloud, AWS, like all this other stuff, but we really enabled the engineers to have a lot of autonomy, let's say. And autonomy didn't mean they could just do whatever they want, but we created environments that made it safe for them to experiment. And they're great engineers, and it was very much a collaborative experience. But we had, for this company, we were storing a lot of customer data, and go figure, that's where our majority of our costs was like, this customer data. And so we were always looking for ways to be able to reduce that cost. And so I actually talked about this during my DevOps Enterprise Summit talk last year. But what we wound up doing is, they designed this cache, and we would put that in front of the database. And then, we obviously helped them deploy it. But like, the engineers could launch their own instances to try out new things because we made it safe for them. They literally only had like a few different switches they could turn on and off. And the main one was, how many instances do you want to launch? And that was it. Like, they told it, and then the software did all the work for them. They didn't look around for IP addresses. They did, a lot of this stuff gets taken care of for you by Kubernetes at this point. But so, we had to match the storage subsystems and things like that. And ultimately, this whole process, eventually we replaced like an entire area of storage and reduced our storage costs by conservatively 75%. And that was the majority of the cost for the company. And so we reduced that by 75%. It's crazy, like what kind of an impact that has on the business. But like really the only way that we could do something like that is to allow the developers to ship code, to launch infrastructure, to, and partner with them. This is how we're going to handle failures, all kinds of things like that. And then, we're able to have like a major impact. And so for me, like, I feel like that's really exciting for a developer because they get to ship code quickly. We're not in their way. It's really low friction, and they really get to have a major impact on, on the way that the company works. So their work is valuable and it's valued, and they're not just sitting there, not that there's anything wrong with, but, changing a button from orange to blue like that. They actually had like a huge impact on the bottom line.
Amazing. And just to recap, by implementing this DevOps movement in various companies, we're able to really look at what that value stream looks like. We're really able to look at speed versus quality and what levers we might have to actually improve on that. And at the end of the day, in this particular example, we're able to create staging environments where developers can essentially launch their code, test their code, get it to production all themselves. And I would be hard pressed to find anybody who would raise their hand and say they've never run into staging environment problems before. So it's amazing to see that even this focus on something as maybe far-fetched as speed versus quality from an engineering team ends up equating to investments into their tooling, into their value stream, and ultimately letting them ship code even more.
We let them launch in production. So I think the important thing about that, to your point about the staging environment, is that when you would embrace like the DevOps principles, and obviously there's a lot of different competing models for how we like to describe it. And, one of my favorites is Damon Edwards and John Willis's CAMS model. So culture, automation, metrics, and sharing. But like that automation stuff, like, it's really important that people build their staging environments with the same tools, the same everything that they build their production environments, so that, yes, to your point, we can launch something in staging first. But like you said, who hasn't had a problem with their staging environment? Like a lot of the reasons that people have problems with their staging environments is that staging doesn't look like production. Staging is like some like loose approximation of production, which, maybe that's valuable, maybe that's not. But like, if I'm building my production environment with the exact same, let's say, Terraform code or whatever that I'm building my staging environment, now those things are going to look alike. And those, there'll be a smaller version, right? Maybe it's not a 4x large, maybe it's just a large or whatever. But like, there's real value in testing there, and as we know from the continuous delivery book, like way cheaper to fail faster than failing, once you've gotten into production. And so like there's a huge advantage to being able to do those things. But we really empower the developers to have a lot of power. And I'm sure some of your listeners are gonna say like, well, that's fine for you, but we have PCI, or we have high trust, or we have HIPAA and whatever. And there are ways of being able to do things in a very DevOps manner, even within those highly regulated environments. It's just, you have to go back and think about, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? Because most of the time when people are trying to solve those problems in those highly regulated environments, they're not actually focusing on what the regulation says. They're focusing on the way that most people satisfy that regulation. But that's not what the regulation says. The regulation doesn't say how to satisfy it. It says what must be satisfied. And so like, it's really important for people to go back and actually look at, what's being asked of them, instead of looking at the common solution that most people use to solve that problem.
And really exciting, because I think you're touching on something which we more or less both help with. On the Haystack side, we do it through, analytics and metrics, and on your side through your assessment tool. But it's more or less at every company. While there's this DevOps movement, the more important thing is to really understand speed versus quality, understand what we're trying to achieve. And every company might actually look different, and that's okay. We're here to find the right solution for your team. At Haystack, we do it again through metrics, whereas your assessment tool really dives in and tries to understand what levers, what capabilities we can actually implement to get these things done, which is pretty exciting, because it's almost like two sides to the same coin. At the end of the day, we're helping you get to this point of what do you say, 10 deploys per day versus your competitor who's doing 10 deploys per year. And it's really something that everybody can accomplish with the right shift of mindset. And lucky for us, more and more people are thinking this way, and we can see the benefits of that in so many research studies. Now, one of the things where we often find objections, at least with Haystack, or maybe not objections, but confusion, is where does this DevOps movement fit into things like mission statements or OKRs or goal setting measures like performance reviews? Do you see this fitting into that, or is this like entirely separate? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, like you kind of just said, right? DevOps is more about like capabilities and things like that. So they can fit into mission statements. They can fit into OKRs because, I mean, a mission statement may be a little bit difficult, but like certainly for engineers to have goals, and for me as someone who's been an engineering manager for many years, like even more important than engineers having goals, but engineering teams having goals. Measuring individual engineers is a fraught with so much danger, but engineering teams need to have goals, and a lot of the things that we're talking about are important goals for engineering teams, right? To say, and this is something we do in transformation, right? Well, this company used to release every 2 months, and now they release every 2 weeks. Like, yeah, every 2 weeks doesn't sound so great when you're comparing it to 10 deploys a day. But compared to every 2 months, it's huge. It's, tremendous, like kind of advancement. You're going whatever that is, 8 times faster. Like if speed is important and we can go 8 times faster and still maintain quality, or you and I both know this, your quality is most likely going to go up, right? Because there's smaller changes now, so less risk per change. And so, you can roll back something that's really tiny really easily, generally, and things like that. So I think that's where like these kinds of things can fit into like team goals, is because, hey, it's the product team wants to get shorter cycle times.
Right.
So like they're interested in it. The engineering teams want to be able to ship, like they don't want to wait around forever to be able to get their code out there and get feedback. So it becomes a company goal, but it also becomes a team goal to emphasize these things. And for me with my clients, I generally tell them, don't obsess over these. Like these are the areas that you need to focus on. Saying like, oh, we got our deployment frequency from 8 times a day to 9 times a day. Let's pat ourselves on the back. Like, we all know about the law of diminishing returns. Like, don't go crazy on that. But like, you can definitely tell where your company isn't up to speed, and people feel that friction, and people feel, you talked about it earlier, that weight like dragging you down a bit. And so I think these things are definitely important. My only caution there is like, when you've made it a lot of improvement, let's not forget about the other things too. And those other things fit in with the DevOps movement. So like we talked about the CAMS model a few minutes ago, the S is sharing. So like, hey, maybe we need to improve our documentation. Maybe we need to improve our onboarding experience so that developers can come up to speed faster, or any engineer can come up to speed faster. So it's not just about deployment frequency or whatever. There's lots of different things that we can focus on, and all of those things are important. And that's why we do prioritization, certainly as a team and things like that, because it kind of gets back to what you were saying is like, while everybody thinks that their company is unique, there are a lot of common characteristics between companies. The goal is to find the things that are important to your company that you need to improve. And this idea of, continual improvement, we talk about it as Kaizen. People want to read about that. Highly recommend Toyota Kata by Mike Rother. It's an awesome book. But, what are the things that we need to address at our company in order to give us this advantage? And, that can take lots of different forms.
Well, that sounds fantastic. It's a great way of thinking about the DevOps movement and how it sort of fits into your organization. What I always find interesting is that the teams who don't have this idea of continuous improvement, I know you touched on deployment frequency, but even if this was a goal to improve at least a little bit or focus on investments so that we can remove those bottlenecks, Teams that don't have that are sort of stagnant. And while the rest of the industry is getting better, you're sort of sitting in the same spot. And what I've always found interesting, especially working with, let's say, marketing or sales team, there's always an improvement goal. And what I find so strange is that on the engineering team, there's so many teams out there that don't actually strive for improvement, faster, higher quality, and it's almost a little bit disappointing to see teams just going through that JIRA checklist, just mark done, mark done, mark done, sprint over sprint. So it is actually really exciting when we were able to see teams improve on some of those 4 key metrics, actually get some of these investments like pushing to production, owning the entire value stream with a few clicks of the button, and really getting the tools that they need to do their job really well. So I know we're talking a whole lot about the business outcomes and everything like that, and I think we touched a little bit earlier on the term elite performers. Can you elaborate on what that means? Like, what is an elite performer for software engineers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to get too hung up on the numbers. In the State of DevOps report, they categorize, elite performers as doing like these many deploys a day, or this amount of frequency, or they can recover from errors like in under a day, whereas like other companies could take like 2 weeks. But like I sort of shy away from that stuff a little bit, because maturity models are, the old all models are wrong, some models are useful. Like, maturity models are useful, but like I don't want people to get super hung up on whether or not they're a high performer or an elite performer or things like that. I think they'll know. You can feel it. We talk about flow, not just in terms of like the value stream, but like people getting into a flow at work. Like you're engaged, like work is flying by, you're having fun, you're shipping code, you're doing whatever the goals of the business are. And so I think it's important to have those sort of goals as a North Star, so we know where we're going. But I when people start talking about like, well, it says in the book that like we should deploy whatever 6 times a day, and we only deploy 7, 5 times a day. What can we do? Who cares? Like that's not what's holding your business back anymore. But the elite performers are the ones that are deploying often. They have low cycle times. So the idea of doing something until that thing is in production does not take 6 months or anything like that. They do have a low change failure rate, and we're going to have lower change failure rates when we're shipping more often, because it's smaller changes, so we can reason about it more. It's going to have less interaction with other parts of the system. We're also going to have really good testing, whether that's unit testing, integration testing, security testing, performance testing. There's all kinds of stuff we can do for that. And then the time to recover. And the interesting thing about time to recover, is there's lots of different components of what makes a short time to recover. And we talked about models a second ago, like people having shared mental models across the team about how this system actually operates, so that when there's a failure, more people understand the nature of the failure. Whether you have instrumentation, do you do distributed tracing, do you do exercises to introduce failure into your environment, so that number one, you're building those mental models. Number two, you're making it so that you can actually instrument things if you need to understand them. There's all kinds of different elements that what we called capabilities earlier, that we need to develop, like, so that we are able to be an elite performer, and we have that balance of speed and quality to get stuff out into production. But again, there's a lot of elements to that, obviously.
Awesome. So I think we touched a little bit on, we're focused more on improvement, where we want to strive for lower cycle times, lower change failure rates, more frequent deployments. But looking too much at the aggregates, let's say comparing ourselves to Netflix now, it's maybe not the most healthy way to look at it. Let's look at this concept of the DevOps movement, continuous improvement in general, and let's strive for getting better and actually investing some of these resources back into the team to improve that developer experience, to improve that value creation and that entire value flow.
How many people are not intentional about the work that they do? And so I wrote an article called "Engineering the Hiring of Engineers," and it was very much this idea of like, if you want to be successful in your hiring, you need to design a system that, you know, gives you the outcomes that you're looking for. And so, you know, to what you said, you know, a little bit earlier, is like, I've seen so many teams that don't have that sense of continual improvement because they work on the work that flows across their desk. And whatever shows up last is the thing that they work on, you know, or, you know, when they finish something, they work on the next thing that showed up. But it's very hard to make improvement that way. You sort of get improvement by accident if things all seem to kind of work out. So, you know, with so many of my clients, I go in and I say, well, what do you want out of this system?
Right.
Like, what are you trying to go for here? Because right now there's no intentionality here. We're getting work done and we're busy, but being busy and being productive are not the same. And being productive is that idea of like continual improvement. How do we get better? And people, you know, and it's not like this does, you know, the clients do it. They turn it around. Like, it's not impossible, but like, we start working on what do we want to get out of this system. And it's fascinating because I was reading a series of blog posts yesterday, and they were talking about this for sales teams and marketing teams, about designing the system to get what you want out of it. And I was like, yeah, it makes sense. You know, to your point earlier about who's DevOps for, like, we can apply these principles to all kinds of different areas of the company and apply, you know, and have those all show up together. You and I might be talking about deployment frequency and change failure rate, but these principles are sort of global and universal. And like, let's apply these, you know, things. So they're like, hey, you want to reach, you know, X number of leads in a month. How do you do that? Like, it's not just by like, hey, we make some random phone calls and hope for the best. Like, we actually have to figure out, like, we're going to spend this much on LinkedIn ads, this much on Facebook ads, this much on this. We're going to speak at these number of events. Like, it's a plan, you know, it's intentional. And so like that, I think that's a huge thing to be able to recognize that. So you are able to make those improvements.
And like you said, it's more of a mindset than anything. And would you say that the DevOps movement, continuous improvement, or really any of the concepts that we've talked about today is for a specific type of team or organization, or is this more like a global, anybody can try it, aspire to implement these practices and ultimately reap the same benefits?
Yeah, I think you know, Satya Nadella has his quote that's every company is a software company. And I think that breaks down a lot of the barriers to people doing this kind of thing. So like, you know, one of my favorite examples is like John Deere makes tractors, you know, and they're expensive, like super expensive tractors. One of the most important things that you get with a John Deere tractor are the software updates, which is nuts. It's a tractor, you know, like it's not, we're not talking about the oil, you know, filter. We're talking about software downloads that go onto your tractor to improve your ability to whatever with the crops, blah, blah, blah. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of companies to, you know, to look at this. And I've applied DevOps thinking and DevOps principles to vaccine delivery, like for injection for the coronavirus vaccine. So, you know, it really depends on like what parts we're taking. But, you know, when you look at, we talked about, there's a lot of different models for how to describe DevOps. You know, the first way of Gene Kim's 3 ways is systems thinking. And systems thinking is very much not a software only problem. Like, systems thinking is a great way of looking at lots of problems. And that's where we get our, you know, intentionality that we were talking about. We design these systems to get the output that we want. And so that's broadly applicable to a lot of different parts of the business, or, you know, doesn't even have to be a business. The vaccine stuff was, you know, for a volunteer organization.
Awesome. John Deere tractors is an interesting example. At Haystack, we work with a variety of different companies, from medtech, fintech, all the way to, you know, standard mobile apps that you might have. I think you touched on I can't quote you, I'm trying to remember now, but everybody thinks that they're unique. And while that's surely the case with your business model or your product, at the end of the day, these concepts are really, universal. Speed and quality and improvements on those is really super impactful, from John Deere tractors to, even Tesla. I think Michael Siebel, who's one of our group partners over at Y Combinator, was saying, I love that this car is getting better. Every month I get this email from Elon Musk about how my car is getting better. And that's just so profound. And you can see how that impacts profitability, customer satisfaction, even with just that one example of sort of Michael Siebel getting this email about his car.
Yeah.
So pretty amazing how all these concepts actually come into play. Super exciting to see these companies actually adopting them, and us being able to say things like John Deere and Tesla and have these concrete examples of wins for this movement. So, we've covered a whole bunch today. What is the DevOps movement, why it matters, how this really looks for engineering teams, who it's for. So I just wanted to, close this out and quickly thank you, Dave, for joining us today. Super quick but insightful conversation. Dave, could you tell the listeners where they can maybe reach out to or learn more about what you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, all the other fun stuff, but the company is called Mangoteque, Mangoteque, which is a bit of a play on the fact that I have a French last name, and done a lot of stuff in tech. But you go to mangoteque.com. I've got links to the blog there, all the other different accounts and stuff like that. That's the one-stop shop to be able to find anything and everything.
Awesome. And anybody who's listening, Dave and I have had several conversations. If you're wondering about the DevOps movement, he's probably one of the best people to reach out to and talk to while we approach this concept of continuous improvement from different angles, us working on metrics and him with his assessment tool. There are so many different ways of companies approaching this. And Dave is one of the experts in this space. So if you're curious or if you're sort of inspired by this conversation, would highly encourage you to reach out or check out Mangoteque on their website. And again, my name is Julian Kalina. I'm the CEO of Haystack. And if you want to learn more about DevOps or any of the 4 key metrics that we talked about today, Haystack helps measure those straight from GitHub, along with many other insights to help you really spur your DevOps movement and kick it off the ground. And you can reach me at julian@usehaystack.io. I read each and every email in my inbox and would love to hear from you. So just to recap, this is the part 1 of a 2-part series. If you want to hear the next episode, just like and subscribe on this video here. And until then, thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks a lot, Dave, and
Cheers. Thanks
see you
for
later.
having me.